Yeah.
First of all, my question is, do you have any tips on like how to like carve out space in the mid frequency range? Like I always feel like I'm trying to plan out what I'm gonna have there, and by the end of it, like I'm in a rabbit hole and like a perk and like between the 800 and like 5K range, just like a word wall.
Yeah, the biggest factor comes back to not thinking about frequencies, I think, for that. I mean, the mid-range is ultimately like that's where we get a lot of information. We get musical information from that range. We get the sort of identify different instruments as being what they are. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that range that's really important. The first place to start is with levels, right? Figuring out, instead of thinking about it frequency-wise and trying to EQ stuff, thinking about how are things going to fit in terms of dynamics. So it's amazing what can be solved, again, with just levels. Throw away your EQ plugins and achieve a good mix by just putting things in the right space. And maybe if a little bit, the right space at the right time. So maybe when something first is introduced, it's a little extra loud, so you appreciate it and notice it, and then maybe it doesn't need to be so loud anymore. So the more that you can think about what you can get away with removing, the better. If you don't want to make something quieter, and you definitely hear it's a frequency element, then you can go for that. But there's some other like little tricks that I'll do, which sort of ties into that, which one would be I'll make a sound quieter, but then EQ more drastic. I mean, generally, the more that something's back in the mix, the more drastic I'm getting with EQing it. If a sound is well recorded and sounds good soloed, I don't want to necessarily, and it's a foreground instrument, I don't want to necessarily EQ that. Like, let's just lay that out there how it's supposed to be and how it is good. The more that something's back in the mix, the more that I'm probably just intending for it to be heard in a certain way. Like, only the high end matters of this instrument, or only the low mids matter of this instrument. And the more I'll be removing the frequencies that I don't need and are just basically adding clutter that you're not really hearing in there. So the quieter a sound is, the more I aggressively EQ it. So there's sometimes that you might do something like that. You might say, okay, this is really a background perk thing, but all I really need is the mid-range from it. I don't care if it's lacking the lows, and so I'll high pass it up, and then or maybe vice versa. I mean, a lot of times what I'm doing as well, which I mentioned, is it's similar. It's solving the problem with volume rather than with frequency. With percussive sounds in particular, a lot of time they're really too compressed, and you might be doing it yourself, self-defeating yourself, like, oh, I want it fat, so I'm compressing it. But no, it doesn't really need a compressor. It might need the opposite. It might need an expander. It might need dynamics like I do with LFO tool, where I'm enveloping the sound to emphasize the transient. Once you've heard that, as soon as there's a little bit of notiness or whatever, just a couple hundred milliseconds at most, it's done its thing. It's done its part. It's a rhythmic element. It's defined time. It's made its mark. Now let's get it out of the picture. We don't need it to go or whatever it's doing. That's like taking up space and time. It's boring at that point. It's already said its thing. So it's the transients that I care about. And so I'm trying to make sounds smaller with dynamics, with volume, not getting them to just hang out and sort of like, draw out their words too long. Just be a little more like percussive and like you want from them, a little more tight and clamped down. So when it's your own production, sometimes you can just do that with envelopes, get your sustain level down on the sampler, whatever like that. If it's stems, then that's when I'm turning to LFO tool and basically recreating the envelope over it so that I can sculpt it what fits to taste. Other than that, it's also useful to see and learn what makes up a sound, because the more that you understand what's there. So spectrum analyzers can definitely be your friend. Generally there's the fundamental, which is the pitch of it, and then spectrum analyzers can be a bit misleading though, because you can basically either have a good frequency resolution or a good time resolution, but not both. That's just the way that they work. So you have this like block size in the Ableton spectrum, and you see this in a lot of other spectrum analyzers as well. And a smaller block size means that this is like the number of samples that it's using to calculate what it's going to plot, right? So 2048 samples, we could say, okay, well that's like 1/20th of a second at 44.1, right? So we have 1/20th of a second being represented. 16,384, okay, that's more like 1/3 of a second. That's a much bigger slice of time. So you're either looking at things with good time resolution or good frequency resolution. 16,384 would show us a lot more frequency info. But realistically, you don't necessarily need that detailed of frequency info, especially if you're painting with broad strokes, like wider EQs and stuff like that. So using a smaller block size is going to give you more updates per second visually, and better understanding of time. But even then, it's kind of hard to necessarily see on a spectrum analyzer what's truly happening over time. For instance, you could have a kick drum, which is I don't know, I could use Serum even for this, but if you have a kick drum that's, yeah, I'll use Serum just to try to demonstrate this. So if you have a sine wave, say, a sine wave, as you know, is a single frequency. It's just a single, whatever pitch I play on the keyboard is what we're hearing. So that's a pure tone. Obviously, if we look at the spectrum, we would see the kind of the same thing. I mean, you see noise down here, but this is basically inaudible. You can see we're at 144 dB, so we're like 24 bits down there. So we have this single frequency. This would actually be a single thin line. All of this is just artifact from the analyzer itself. So we really have a single frequency, a single point going on here. But then over time, let's say like we have, the easiest example would be to start the phase in a place that produces a click. So if I put that envelope to 0 there, right? What's happening is I've turned off this random, which scatters the phase to be different every time you hit the note. So I've turned that off. So now every time I hit the key on the keyboard, it's instantly jumping to this full code or this full crest of the sine wave, right? So you can imagine there's like a square edge right at the very start. What that's doing is that's adding all these frequencies in. And this isn't the best example, but you might think if this was our part playing, that this is what the sound looks like, right? But in reality, the sound is an instantaneous, all of this stuff on the sidebands, just instantaneous, this micro slice of time. And then for the rest of time, it's this single tone with nothing else. But you wouldn't know that if you were looking at the spectrum of that, right? So it can be kind of misleading because when you look at spectrum analyzers, because you don't really understand what happens over time. A percussive sound is a good example. You might have all this high end and stuff like that. That high end's just happening for this tiny slice of time. Generally, you can get away with crazy EQ boosts, unlike the high end of a percussive thing, because you're boosting all those crazy highs, but it's only for this brief moment. So you're just making it more crisp, more defined, but then all of that highs are gone, right? So it's not like it's in the way of your mix, because it's only happening for these brief moments. And I do that a lot on percussive sounds. I'll shelve them at 4K or something like that and give a healthy boost to the high end, because it's not going to interfere and make the sound too bright in a sense, unless it sounds that way to my ears. But you can generally get away with that sort of thing because it's a brief moment in time that it's happening on.
I think there's a question over there. Over here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Steve. I was curious about your approach to mastering. Like, let's say when you're mixing these
Yeah.
records. Let's say you said you push your kick at Unity. Do you have
Yeah.
you find yourself like running out of headroom, and then you have to
Yep.
throw a gain on your master later? Or
Yes, exactly.
Producers are fans of like working with their master chains on. So I was just kind of curious where you fall in on that.
That's right. Yeah, it's kind of dangerous and probably not the best advice to say I put my kick drum at 0, except it's the truth that I do. The thing that you run into is exactly that, is if you have your kick drum at 0 and you have any other sound happen at the same time, if this kick drum is actually hitting the 0 mark, you're going to be having clipping at your master. So you're going in to your master stage at over already. So good thing with DAWs this day is that you should have, as far as I know in all of them now, you have infinite headroom. So you can be clipping, so to speak, or you can be going over 0, I should say. It's not actually clipping. It's going over 0, and then you can attenuate, and there's no distortion. There's no artifact happening, because just because the signal hit 1.2, now it's being multiplied down, so it's no longer above the 1.0 mark. We're good. Unfortunately, it's not always a blanket case. You really should be cautious not to enter plugins over the 0 mark. So you might have a Waves plugin, you might have something like that. You don't know what they're doing to the signal in the case that it goes over 0. A lot of those DSP routines, these filters and stuff like that, they're coded specifically not to handle a signal over 0 dB, or the math won't work. The math will blow up. So they need to either attenuate, do the process, and boost back up, or they need to say, oh, if it's over 1.0, if it's over maximum volume, maximum value, clip it. So they're clipping on the way in a lot of the time. So rule is don't let plugins go over 0 ever. So you want to build that headroom in, and that's the general reason why people say, oh, put your kick drum at 6. But even putting your kick drum at 6, you're not safe from this. That's not like a Band-Aid that's going to fix all situations. You could still easily go over 0, especially if you start letting your kick drum get drowned in the mix. So it's best to have a utility. I mix with Ableton Live, and I always have a utility on my master as the first thing in the chain. And I'm making sure that this is preventing from going over 0. Sometimes I'll use a level meter here if I need a better view of that, but I'm going to make sure that this goes stays below 0. And I usually let it get pretty close, because the odds are, if I'm in a loud part of the song and I don't see it going over 0 there, if it is going to go over 0, it's going to be for a sample, and you're not going to really hear that if you have to clip one sample at some point. It's good enough for rock and roll, essentially. Not trying to land on Mars with this mix. So yeah, that's that. I'll let a single sample clip, but I won't want to clip like enough of a wave cycle that you're going to hear some squaring or anything like that. So that's why I keep this down, make sure I'm not seeing anything go over 0 on that tiny bit of the meter there. And then the rest of my master chain, I'm mixing into a fairly aggressive master chain almost all the time. And there's not like a set chain that I'll use, but I do have every song I've ever mixed saved as an Ableton rack, audio effect rack. So like if you use Ableton or use most software like Logic and whatnot let you do this too, save your chain after you've made a song with the name of the song. And then if you're ever starting another song or whatever, and you say, oh, I can use that as a template or a starting point. So when I'm getting handed stems from people, I might get their stems up, get things in the ballpark of, since I've done it enough, I kind of know where that would be just based on, okay, that's, kick drum, let's get that near 0, and the bass, maybe let's get that 10 or 15 down, and snare, maybe, somewhere in between. So it depends on the style of music and all that, of course, too. But once I've got things sort of in the place where I think they're going to be, then I can try out a few different of my previous master chains of songs that might be similar or whatnot, that I know that the result was good. And it's amazing how different the results can be with some of those. Usually I'll find one of those chains that just wins out clearly over the other ones, like night and day. Like, oh my God, if I had to work with a lot of these other ones, it would be terrible. So that's why it's nice to have a bunch of different ones. And so I have that. I have every BSOD track we've ever done. I have et cetera, just all there ready to go if I want something as a starting point. And most of these do have a lot of common elements in them. I mean, most of them are adding a little bit of width with like a stereo imager, which you can do even with the built-in one here in Ableton with the width control right here. So just a little bit. You never want to go too extreme on those because you're canceling. It's like a mid-side balance control, right? So you don't want to be taking away your mid signal and replace it with side, right? Because anything that's mono or pan center, so to speak, right, is now gone. So it's not like we want to be without that stuff. It's just that we want to have just a little bit of width. So anything that's a stereo signal, essentially this is just affecting stuff that is stereo to begin with. And of course, it's changing your mid-side balance, so it is going to make anything quieter. So this is something I'm doing before I'm really setting levels, right? You don't want to try to do this as a mastering stage after, because you are really messing with your mid versus side balance here. So it's good to have that set before you've gone in to mix your stuff. If you had a stereo sounding pad, if you tried to do that in a separate mastering stage and you try to make it wide, now you're bringing up the volume of that pad, essentially. And you might not want that, right? You might want the width, but not the level. So it's good to kind of get that done ahead of time. So I have usually a little bit of width. It might be 10%, might be 20%, but probably not more than that. So in other words, 110, 120%, something around in there. And then I will have a compressor or 2 or 3 on the chain. Generally, I'll have one that's acting as a parallel compressor. So what's going on there is, the way I think about it is that a parallel compress is going to be bringing up the quiet parts of your mix, essentially, because what you're doing is you're squashing the mix more than you would probably squash the mix in a non-parallel situation. So I'm going to have a more extreme threshold or ratio going on the compressor. So it's a really squashed version of your mix that you're now mixing into your mix, right? So it's what the result is that this squashed version is now starts filling in the peaks. If you think about the dry signal, right, which is our nice dynamic mix, it has lots of like silence, quiet parts, right? Now we're mixing in this squashed one. It ends up that now you're really noticing that more in these dips. So it's filling in the mix from the quiet parts up, rather than how you think about a compressor normally, which is more the opposite, which is reducing the peaks. I'll usually have a parallel comp in there, and I'll have a limiter at the end for sure. Which varies on my use of it between just catching stray overs and actually doing something on every kick drum, right? So it might be, generally speaking, it's going to be catching every kick, but almost nothing else. That's kind of my rule of thumb, right? So I might be bringing a dB or maybe 2 off of the kick drum. And that's because the kick drum, as I mentioned, is set to 0, is set as the loudest thing. And so the result of this is that it's essentially brought that kick drum that was made ridiculously loud to begin with, not so ridiculously loud. And there's sort of there's two effects going on. One is that it's bringing the kick drum back in a sense, but really what it's doing is it's boosting everything else forward. In other words, it's reducing our dynamic range. So that's one thing that's doing is, of course, just bringing that stuff back together a bit when the kick happens. The other thing that's doing is, since it's applying gain reduction, you would say, well, Steve, why don't you just turn down the kick drum? I mean, if you're just trying to make the kick drum quieter, and that would be, if that's really all I wanted, that would be the better way to do it. It's also adding in a bit of inherent pumping, right, like you get from sidechain compression. Because what's happening is every time the kick happens, the entire mix is getting quieter. Every time the kick goes away, the entire mix is coming back to normal, you could say. So you never knew that the kick drum was a little loud to begin with, because you're never hearing it a little loud because the limiter's kicking in every time the kick happens. But everything else is getting pumped away a bit, which just gives you the illusion of the kick drum being extra loud. But this is all done subtly, right? This is all a dB or two. This isn't being done in a way where it's like, this isn't like, let's make the whole mix sound pumping. You know, that's not where it's taking place. If I want that, I'll be doing that with LFO tool or with sidechain compression on buses of the things that I want to pump. So upstream from the mastering chain, I generally do some sub-mixing and sub-mastering, because ultimately mixing is the art of getting everything down to your stereo mix, and it doesn't really matter how you get there, right? You could combine all your vocals into a vocal bus, or you could not. You could combine all of your drums into a drum bus, or you could not. You could combine your vocals and your drums and your bass into a sub-mix bus, and I do that sort of thing, right? So I'll take generally everything except the bass and the kick, and that's my submaster. And so the reason I do that is so that I can sculpt everything there at that stage and still let the kick and bass through in the way that I want. In other words, that's where I can do processing on the mix, but not on the low-end elements of the mix that I generally want to be clean and punch through. So it's also a mental balancing point, right? So I can balance the kick, the bass, and the everything else with these three faders, and I always arrange them in that way. So I have kick, bass, and bus. And so now I can just really get that blend of everything right there very easily. And so it's just a handy submix point, right? Drop-off point.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Going back to what you were talking about earlier, I was wondering, since everybody experiences low frequency differently depending on the situation, like you were talking about how in the headphones, you know, everything would come through clear, or when you're in a club, everything would just kind of be drowned out through the sub. Would you recommend making two separate mixes to play out live, for example, or something different that you would play through headphones or speakers that wouldn't be bouncing around several walls at once?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's whether or not to have different versions of your mix, and maybe different amounts of low end is the way you phrased it, for playing out versus home listening, that kind of thing. People have definitely done a lot of that. DJs and such have done their own mixes for the club versus like released mixes and whatnot, for a variety of reasons. Extending them, of course, is an obvious one, right? You might want a longer version for the club or whatnot, and not for people to listen to as a piece of music, because they're going to get bored. They're not going to put up with 8 minutes of loop. So yeah, but as for the low end, you know, that's a good thing to try. I think it really depends on whether you need that or not. To me, it's kind of one and the same a bit. Like if I think about mixing a Will.i.am track or something like that, right? He wants it to work in the club, and that's why he's bringing it to me, because he's got plenty of mix guys, but then they know how to mix stuff that sounds poppy, but they don't know how to make it sound like he wants it to sound in the club. So that's part of my whole thing, is just creating space. But I would also want that to be the version that goes on radio or gets out there as a commercial release, not just for him to DJ in the club, because if they play it at a Lakers game, I want it to also not sound soupy, right? Like, even though they probably wouldn't have the same wall of subs, it's the same principle at play, which is that we don't want these low frequencies that are just blending into the next ones. Although pretty much anything at a Lakers game would probably sound soupy. But anyway, you could do that. I mean, you could experiment with having different mixes, especially, you know, for yourself as a DJ to play out. Although when you say that, I mean, the thing that comes to mind to me is not as much about just for the low end, because I think you can strike a compromise without needing to do that, but more for level, because people live want their tracks to be competitive and or loud, right? But you don't necessarily want to release tracks that sound that way. It's unpleasant. So that's the thing that I recommend to people to do, is make this obnoxiously limited version for yourself for your sets, and so it competes with other people's obnoxiously over limited songs that they're releasing that way. But when you release your track, don't do that to it. In fact, you don't necessarily have to do it that much for yourself live too, because you generally have control over the faders. If you're a DJ who's also thinking engineering wise at least, and not just trying to crush stuff, you're able to make louder songs a little quieter, and that way if the song is more dynamic, you can turn it up a bit. And when it comes to mixing, my mantra is always like, I try to make songs that you want to listen to loud, not songs that are loud in of themselves. So I'm always, there's a lot of songs that I just don't want to hear loud because it just sounds bad. They're so compressed and limited, and it's just turning it up is just threshold of pain happens really quick, and it's not really like sending you like walls of like cool waves of low frequencies and stuff. So I would love having dynamics and stuff, which does mean that your RMS is down below some other commercial releases. But most people agree that music has to start heading that way anyway. I mean, things should sound good loud. They don't need to sound loud in and of itself. Every listener has their own volume control, and it's just gotten ridiculous to feel the need to compete. But long story short, if you do feel the need to compete and for your sets or something like that, it comes, you're practicing your DJ set and you say, okay, let me mix into my track, and it just sounds quieter. Yeah, crush it for your live set, but you don't have to crush it for the release necessarily, unless your audience is mostly DJs. If your audience is mostly DJs, maybe you do have to play that loudness war game. I don't personally subscribe to that. It's gotten out of control. I mean, we thought we were being bad with the BSOD stuff, and now you listen to that and it sounds like open and dynamic, and the RMS is way lower than the stuff that's out there now. And so, your old win, ... But when music...
So maybe one or two more questions. Liam, go ahead.
Do you have a few examples of mixes that you've done that you're really proud of that you could share with us so we could check them out?
I don't have a lot of stuff on here. There's a lot of stuff I've done recently that's not released that comes to mind first and foremost, but in terms of stuff I've done, I mean, there's the will.i.am, Justin Bieber, That Power. I was proud just to beat out 5 guys with SSLs and all of that, with using Ableton and like my own plugins, but so there's that. I mean, the song I'm not a fan of, but the mix, I'm happy with how it came out. I mix a lot of stuff for artist Funk Agenda, and so you could listen to any of his last dozen or so releases, and I think a lot of that stuff I like the sound of. La Castlevania, I've mixed his last dozen or so releases, and so I like I like his music. It's different. It's like part rock and part dance, and he doesn't come from a rock background, so it's just sort of haphazardly reminds you of rock music without trying to actually go through the motions of be like a rock band. So I like La Castlevania stuff, Funk Agenda. I think we've done pretty good on a lot of his mixes. He did a Clarity mix for Zed. He did a BT mix recently. I don't know if it's out that I mixed. A lot of his other releases, Half Man, Half Drugs, and I can't think of all the ones, but that would be some other ones that I like. It hits that sweet spot to me of like being loud enough that it's not like sounds stupidly quiet or something like that, but gives you the illusion of dynamics, because sounds tend to have space. Things tend to have space. So for me, it hits the sweet spot. But honestly, I think that there's a lot of people that do a great job with a lot of stuff. I'm not like super critical when it comes to listening stuff. I'm just happy when I can please clients, or we can listen back to the rough mix after I've mixed it, and you just notice how much better it sounds. I always have the rough mix in there as like a reference track, and then I'll bind a key to it, right? Like the number 2 or something. Rather, I don't do it that way. I leave it muted and I bind the key to the solo, like that, right? So at any time, if I want to switch to the ref, all I have to do, I messed that up, right? All I have to do at any time if I want to hear the reference mix is just hit the number 2, and it's going to solo the reference track. And then I have that going to an external out, which happens to be my same output, right? That way, it's not going through my master channel of whatever plugins I have on the master. So at any point, I can just hit the number 2, I can hear the rough mix or reference mix, and then I can undo it. And so when you can get to the point where the levels, like, theirs is hitting 0, yours is hitting 0, but yours sounds just twice as loud, but also more punchy and dynamic and open, and then that's when I feel good and happy that I was able to get it somewhere like that. But I don't know, there's nothing that, ultimately I feel like even though I do a lot of mixing, to me, the part I'm proud of, you wouldn't really be able to hear in a mix, which is basically the stuff you're not hearing, right? Or the bad version that you're not hearing. It's showing the stuff in the best light possible. And ideally, you're not noticing the mix. It's not about, wow, great mix. It's about, wow, great tune, hopefully, right? It's about not having to like stress and strain your ears to hear what's there. And so hopefully it's clear, and hopefully like stuff's more or less where it could belong. But yeah, I don't know. It's not, majority of what I do really isn't mixing as well. I do a fair amount of it. I mean, I've spent probably 60 days this last year mixing, so it's a chunk of my time. But it's generally, it's one mix a day kind of thing. I just mixed 20 songs for this girl, Kaya, who's the daughter of Dave Stewart of the Eurythmics, and Dave produced the whole record. So that was great for me because I was always like into the Eurythmics stuff, just cool like moods and sequenced and all that. And so it has his like signature, like very minimal, simple production. And his daughter's got pipes, so it was pleasant to do. Not my thing musically either, but again, it was the same kind of thing where it was fun to like have everyone enjoy how it comes out sounding compared to the rough mix, and it's just pops out of the speakers a bit more and all that. So it's something I enjoy doing part-time. I don't think I'd want to do it full-time, although it can be a very lucrative job. So some of you that are starting to think, oh, maybe being an artist isn't for me, or composer or whatever, I know guys that mix records for a living that have 100 cars, including multiple Ferraris and Lamborghinis and whatever they want. So you can do very well on it once you get to the point where you can negotiate royalties, and because that's really where the money is. Most mixers get a point or 1% of an album, but if you're doing, if you do 100 albums a year, which you probably won't, you'll probably do 40, but still, you can make a good percentage. You can make a lot more than any one artist would make, right? So you can do better than the rock stars, essentially, mixing records if you build a name for yourself. Granted, there's only a dozen guys out there that have got to that echelon, but there's also lots of guys that do it for a living. And to me, that falls into my dream gig, which has always been, working with technology and working with music for a living. And it's a lot better than working on full albums, in my opinion. Unless it's your own album, that's an exception. But working on other people's records is emotionally exhausting. Whereas mixing it, you're in and you're out, one song a day kind of a thing. So at most a few weeks on a record for a full-length album, which most people aren't even doing these days. Most of the work is single mixing now. But it's a lot less emotionally investing when you're just in for a day on a song rather than having to hear that song over and over and over for whatever amount of time. So I quite enjoy it for that way too. It's just like a break from coding and all that. Someone hands me some stems. It's a new challenge. It's a project trying to make this sound good. Finish it off and then forget about it. And so it's
yeah, right here. Go ahead.
When you have clients send you stems, what do you ask them to remove or leave on processing?
I tend to trust their opinion a bit on that as much as possible. So the stuff that they think that they're happy with, I'm generally happy with. A lot of times people will have tracks with like 10 or 15 effects, right? And I don't need those all separated necessarily, it's just like generally there's one at a time in the song. I don't need them all scattered this way. If I really wanted to, I could probably identify and break a particular one out. I want to EQ or something like that, and move it to its own track. So I generally ask people to group things in sensible ways. I always want the kick separated. I always want the effects separated. I want the vocal separated. I want the reverb off the vocal, but I also want the vocal reverb ideally. So if they're using a send, that's ideal. Most of the time, I will just roll with what they give me and see how it works out. If they ask, then I'll give them some guidelines, but generally I'll just first let them just send me the stems. Sometimes that's a little overkill, and then I'll contact them and say, hey, I don't really need 32 backing vocals. I didn't realize that there was going to be this. Do you have a submix of these that I could perhaps listen to or have? And then I'll probably be fine with their submix. It's whether or not I can get a better result having all 32, I don't know, but it just makes sort of an unmanageable project sometimes having stuff like that.
Do you want them to leave their EQs and everything on? I've had so many client projects that they're just they're all over the place, and
I don't want their plugins, you know what I mean? I don't want to have a project that has like a bunch of plugins opening up and all that. If asked, once again, like usually I'll just roll with what they give me. If asked, I will well, there's two things to say. If asked, I will tell them if it's a creative part of the sound, leave it on. If it's a mixing thing, take it off. And then if they have buses of stuff, I ask for those too, because that happens a lot of times. People are bus processing stuff for their rough mixes. Happens for me at least. And then so if they have that, I'll ask for those, bounces of those buses as well, and then I'll ask them to take off anything that's on the individual parts, so that and then I'll try to see if I want stuff. Often I can just get away with using their buses. It really depends on that. I mean, I feel like a lot of what I can offer is not necessarily going into the micro details, but getting just the big picture right. So for the most part, I'm dealing with 20 to 40 stems, and I'm just putting stuff in the right space, and I'm carving space, and I'm putting the hierarchy of what's important when in time into a digestible thing. And with the sort of master control and some little bus tweaks and all of that, it can just be in 10 minutes, night and day off of their mix. It can just all of a sudden just put it into the place that they're happy with. And I'm not trying to, make it some like grand work of art. Ultimately, it's not. I don't try to get too precious with it. Ultimately, I try to make it so that I'm happy with it and nothing sticks out, and that they're happy. And then if they want any revisions, I'm always happy to do revisions. That's kind of what I tell people they're partly paying for. I make sure that clear up front, because I'm not the cheapest when it comes to mixing stuff. So I say, if you need revisions, just live with it. Let me know if you want any spot moments changed or anything like that. Be happy to go back and do it, because it's so easy now with, mixing in the box. Recall is a breeze. So I'm more than happy to make a tweak, bounce it out, save as, upload, send them a link. It's like takes me almost no time, and so I do that as well. But I generally try to minimize the amount of clutter in the mix, because I feel like I can just get a better result if I can get a handle on what's there. So I do try to lean towards anywhere they have a bus. I'll favor using their bus of stuff if possible. But that can be some of the most time-consuming part of a mix, is getting stems from a client and trying to sort through their mess. So the more that I understand that, the better. I've started asking some of my clients for screenshots, because they just kind of have a bit of a mess, and it helps me understand what they're doing. In terms of like what tracks are grouped together and that sort of thing, because they'll send me, whatever, say synth lead 1, synth lead 2, synth lead 3, and then synth lead bus, and then synth something else, and then you're like, is that synth something else in the synth lead bus? I don't know, and that kind of a thing. So sometimes I want screenshots so I know what I'm dealing with without trying to like make sense of it all by listening and trying to guess that.
Yeah, Sabrina, go ahead.
So how do you feel about where you are in life now, and what are you excited about in the future?
It's a good question. I'm at a pretty comfortable place in my life right now where what I'm excited about is that I'm able to do what I want, and that people are out there that support me to do that. And that's really like exciting to me, that that with the software in particular, I'm able to just kind of just make the thing I want to make, and that there's people that are sort of my patrons or whatnot, right? The people that buy my stuff, and a lot of people that repeatedly buy my stuff. So I get customers that bought my first plugin, buy my second one, buy my third, and so I love that those people are there and like my stuff and send me emails of thanks on top of the money, which is great. But I really love being able to just do what I want to do for a living, and that's what excites me. I don't have any like specific goals right now, which is a little strange of a feeling, but it's kind of good as well. I spent a long part of my life in ways wanting success, and the goalposts of the definition of success have shifted. I mean, it early on was just really to not have to crawl back to my parents and say I need a place to stay, and then once I got to the place where I was sort of making income, then you can start opening your eyes to other things. I've never had too lofty of goals of like whatever that might be, being have X number of fans or sell X number of records or be an artist even. I mean, that's the one thing, if I have a regret in life, it was never believing in myself as an artist. I never tried. I haven't tried to survive off of making music. And you don't have to make it your full-time occupation to do it. But up until this point, I haven't even been able to have time that I feel I can devote enough to make music that I think is worth caring about. Because ultimately, I think for my definition of being an artist, or what I would want out of it, is to be able to share music with people that I think is worth caring about. It's not just to make a product that sells and makes money or makes popularity or any of that. It's more to make something that I think that people would appreciate and find as special. And so that takes time and work. You know, I've done some of it haphazardly that people have appreciated, and that's great. But there's nothing that I've really put the time in that I feel that personally I would be convicted and believe in, and that I could say play for someone and stay in the room and feel proud about, because I don't have anything on my discography that's, at least myself as an artist, that I would feel like I would want to play for someone. And I don't know. So if anything, that would be something that I'm eager to do a little bit of, is get back into music making, because the good thing about that as well is it also fuels the plugins and the creativity, because you start realizing things and tools that you might want a little bit more. But no, right now I'm most excited about my current lifestyle of just personal stuff, having a new house that has hiking trails and that I can walk my dog and wake up and work the hours I want to work, and that kind of a thing, and not have too much, just basically an enjoyable day-to-day life, which is kind of, to me, the best part of life. I'm looking forward to teaching a bit more again, because I've put that off completely, and I think that it's both my parents are teachers, so it's something that I think is valuable to sort of give back.
I mean, I know you've gone through like tons and tons of talented people and experienced so many different things. Do you still have somebody that inspires you?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that inspire me. I mean, I've watched a number of people go. People's success, of course, kind of inspires me. Watching people go from like a bedroom to a superstar is a pretty exciting thing to see happen. I watched it with Joel first, with the Deadmau5, and getting way bigger than literally when I met him online and we would chat all the time. He was 15, living at home with mom, and just started this stuff and was already sounded amazing. But that really shocked me that he had been, because he was just sort of like good naturally at it. But him, Avicii, I met when he was 17 and watched him like, of course, become a superstar, so to speak, and it's very personally rewarding when you give people advice and they listen to it and then it works for them. It feels pretty amazing. And not to say I'm responsible for either of those guys, because I've not. I've mentored both of them a little, but I've probably learned as much from watching the ways that they work and the things that they do than I've given to them. But I had some weird one with Avicii where I was talking to him about some properties of frequency and tempo and the interrelationship between frequencies and pitch and time, basically. And then years later, after a number of big songs, he's like, "Remember that thing you were telling me about?" He's like, "I've been doing that on every song." And it was just like, what? That was so funny to hear that he had actually, like, because I was just sort of just rambling. I wasn't even telling him to try to do it. But I thought that was pretty cool. But it's basically, the concept is that every BPM has a key that's harmonically lined up with it, and you can find that out by just, say, duplicating 128th notes or something like that, and you'll hear a pitch. And that if you utilize that, then things line up in phase. In other words, if you had a bass note that's holding, and then you have kick drums, the phase between the kick and the bass is going to stay constant, because the key is in phase with your tempo. So I just thought that was kind of like a neat thing I discovered when I was messing around with beat repeating, and it was funny that he went off and used it. Anyway, not a valuable tip that I suggest that any of you do, because I don't think that has anything to do with success. But both of those guys have inspired me. Other people, Zed, his friend of mine, inspires me. Sonny, Skrillex, I mean, when I met him, he was already successful from his band, but I didn't know who he was, and he was just like, "Yeah, man, just got this Ableton Live, trying to figure it out." And you're like, "Yeah, good luck, kid." And a year later, like, comes to dinner, "Let me play you the stuff I've been doing." "Okay." "Whoa, guess you figured it out." Jeez.
What kind of dog do you have?
A dog? Oh, long-haired Chihuahua.
Oh,
Yeah.
So Steve, sorry guys, we're going to have to kind of wrap it up. If it's okay, I'm going to throw out a closing question to you.
Yeah.
One teacher to another, what's the single best piece of advice you can give everyone in the room in terms of how to face their future potential careers, avenues to take, when to say yes, when to say no, clients and jobs, those sorts of things? Best advice you have.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, I think everyone has their own path, right? So you don't have to look to any one person and the way that they have success or define success. don't try to imitate someone, because they already existed. Their music already existed. You don't have to try to. It's really a disservice to yourself to do that, to be in the shadow of even your biggest idols. Don't have to make music that sounds like theirs. Your music can sound different, and it's equally valid. And if you met this idol that was like your dream idol to meet, you're probably going to impress them more and excite them more if you have something to play for them that doesn't sound like their music than if you play something that sounds like an imitation of their music, right? So if you even wanted to impress that person, having your own path and your own voice is going to be better. As for like when to take a certain job and do a certain thing, I've always tried to align myself into a position where I am meeting people, because people are interesting and fun, and learning stuff, right? And if I feel too stagnant where I'm not really meeting people or not really learning stuff, then it's probably time to move on. So I think the best thing that you can do is try to be convicted in yourself that you matter. You can create your own. I mean, ultimately, I like to say something to the effect of that you can create your own solutions. You're not lacking anything to be yourself. You already are you, and that you're a valid voice. You're whatever makes you up, your age, ethnicity, gender, background, situation, unique experiences in life, all of this stuff you can utilize to your advantage. There's none of it's a disadvantage. And so the more that you can embrace it, the more that you can be convicted in empowered, that you don't need external things to make things happen. You don't need a big record deal. You don't need a mastering engineer. You don't need a manager necessarily. You don't need anything to do the things you want to do. I mean, we live in an amazing time. Internet's there. You can get your voice heard. There's an audience that's willing to listen. And so the more that you make something worth caring about, as an artist goes at least, the more you can be valuable. And as for other trades and all of that, I mean, I think like my personal dream was always just to make a living doing things related to creative music, technology, and the intersection thereof. So for me, I always had this pretty open target. It wasn't this one dream that had come true. So the more that you can broaden your horizon of success and definitions of where you just see yourself being happy on a day-to-day basis, the better off you are. Because ultimately, even like the superstar DJ job isn't that wonderful of a lifestyle in my opinion. I mean, yeah, there's those moments on stage that look all grandiose and all that, but so much of it is like holed away at a computer, just like a court stenographer or someone else. I mean, what any kind of job is. And it can be kind of lonely at the top, so to speak. They say it, and it's true too, because I've seen it. So ultimately, the more that you can think about what's going to make you happy on a day-to-day basis and go for that, and the more that you can keep that as a wider target, and because most people change their careers, and what you might think is your dream job, I thought working on albums, on rock records and stuff was my dream job at one point, and it turned into being pretty mundane and not that fun and happy. So even whatever you think is your dream gig, once you attain it, your target of what you want to do is going to probably shift at that point. So the more you keep it open and allow yourself to develop multiple skills, the more that you're going to find yourself in a happy place later on.
Well, certainly on behalf of Pyramind, I thank everybody in the room. Thanks for coming and sharing information and knowledge with us here tonight. And probably more importantly, thank you for all the work. We who use your tools very, very much appreciate it. Please give it up for Steve.
Thanks. Thanks, guys.